Für die Fraktion der Allianz der Liberalen.
Now on behalf of the Liberals and Democrats, Ms. Intveld.
Chair, the images of hundreds of dead bodies floating in the Mediterranean is profoundly horrifying. But the most tragic aspect of this disaster is that it's avoidable. People have died unnecessarily. My group fully supports the joint resolution, and I'm glad that we send a very strong signal to the Commission and the Council in particular, who needs this message, I think. We welcome the swift convening of the Council, but the outcome of their meeting is totally inadequate, and it has been said here before. And we welcome the fact that the budget for rescue operations has been restored to the original levels and not tripled, as you say, but more funding is necessary, as well as the use of humanitarian visa. We must fight the ruthless criminals who get rich trading in human lives. Now, giving asylum to those who have fled war and persecution is a legal as well as a moral duty. This year alone, 2,000 people have drowned in the Mediterranean, but some politicians are shamelessly exploiting this tragedy for their own populist, xenophobic, anti-EU agenda. Some merely call for closing the borders. That's cheap rhetoric, not the solution. But some, like Mr. Farage here, is inventing scare stories about these operations, bringing in thousands of jihadis into Europe. But Mr. Farage knows full well that this is complete and utter nonsense, and that it's about as likely as thousands of Martians coming to Europe. But you aren't interested in the truth, you're only interested in getting elected. Now, the public consultation by Mr. Orban has already been mentioned. Mr. Orban as well is using this tragedy in the Mediterranean for his own populist purposes. And quite frankly, dear Mr. Weber, dear Mr. Brok, this is not about national politics. If anything, then this is about the European values that we stand for. And I hope that the EPP will finally decide to expel Mr. Orban. And incidentally, it's not media reports, it's on the government website. Now, Europe urgently needs policies for legal immigration. The reality is that our continent is rapidly shrinking as part of the world population. Europeans counted for approximately 20% of the world population in the 50s, whereas now we are a mere 7%. We need immigration in order to maintain our prosperity. Now, talking about legal migration is controversial and maybe not very popular, but that is what leadership is all about. It's not about finding the lowest common denominator or only taking easy and popular decisions. Leadership is about the courage to take tough decisions. And I welcome the words of Mr. Juncker, who is indeed showing leadership in this respect, and I would wish that the Council would do the same. And I hope Parliament will show that leadership today. Thank you.
Ja, meine Damen und Herren, ich habe auch wieder.
Ladies and gentlemen, a million blue cards again. You, sir.
You made an accusation that Mr. Farage has made up the allegations that tens of thousands of ISIS and terrorists will be coming to this European continent. Are you therefore saying that those people who have warned us about this, the United Nations, are you saying that the UK's own security services, who have warned us about tens of thousands, and are you saying that the statements from ISIS themselves, who said that they're going to send tens of thousands, are all lies?
Most of the people that we're actually talking about, which we refer to as foreign fighters, are actually homegrown. They're EU citizens. And if anything, Europe has been exporting terrorists, jihadis traveling over there. And what we are talking about here today is rescuing people who are drowning in the Mediterranean because they are fleeing war and conflict, and exactly the people that you are talking about. And it has nothing to do with a flood of jihadis coming to Europe. And that is only invented by Mr. Farage to get himself elected on the 7th of May, Mr. Farage. And I think it is populist and despicable.
Das Wort hat jetzt.
I'd like now to.
The word despicable is thoroughly unparliamentary and should be withdrawn. inħoss li l-kelma despicable għandha tiġi rtirata.
So, Euer Lordschaft, sich das Wort zu ergreifen, ohne es erteilt zu.
Your Lordship, it's also rather unparliamentary to take the floor when you're not granted it. I'd now like to give the floor to Ms. Björk for the United Left.
My thoughts this morning go to all the ones that have lost their loved ones, their brothers.
Those who are most disadvantaged, and they're playing on this. They're playing on fear. They're saying the immigrant is a criminal, the immigrant is potentially a terrorist. Now, as far as we're concerned, that is irresponsible, and it is, again, unworthy of heads of state and government to actually support that discourse. Let me just remind you that all human beings are born free and equal in terms of their rights, in terms of their dignity. Everyone has a right to life, a right to liberty, a right to the safety of his or her person. That is what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And therefore, Mr. Tusk and heads of state and government, I would ask you to please rise to this challenge.
Das Wort hat jetzt für die
And now for the EFDD group, Mr. Farage.
Thank you. 4 years ago I stood here and said that bombing Libya would be a huge mistake. But of course the UK Parliament and this Parliament were desperate. There was a clamour to go to war. And so now we have a failed state of Libya, which is now a conduit being used for criminal trafficking gangs trying to bring people to Europe. We are guilty for this crisis. We are directly guilty for the drownings that are going on. And we are hypocrites in this place when we talk about poverty in Africa, when we pursue a common agricultural policy that puts barriers up to them selling us their agricultural produce, where we have a fisheries policy that rapes and pillages their seas and has caused environmental destruction, and we just assuage our consciences by giving away a bit of foreign aid. I am not blind to the human suffering that we've caused in many of these countries. I would call on this Parliament, this Commission, to end the barriers to trade, to stop the fisheries policy, to ask the United Nations to get involved and to try and help. But the real question we face is, what are we to do? Are we to go down the Australian system in dealing with this crisis? And indeed, the Australian Premier, Tony Abbott, has offered us his advice and help. Australia faced this. And Australia not only have stopped the boats from coming, they've stopped people from drowning. But no, we're not interested in what the Australians have done. We have decided that we can deal with this on our own. So we've decided that people can come and that people won't be sent back. Now I suspect that it's a shock, or will be a hell of a shock, to many European citizens, including the British, to understand that we've already agreed a common European asylum system. And what today is about, and today's resolution, is the direct implementation of it. The problem, ladies and gentlemen, is this. The definitions for who qualifies for asylum are so wide, they include not just people coming from war, not just people coming from failed states. Mr Juncker this morning seemed to suggest that perhaps it would even include people who were fleeing poverty. I'm sorry, we simply can't accept countless millions. Already in countries like mine, 77% of the population say we cannot take immigration at current levels. But there is a real and genuine threat. When ISIS say they want to flood our continent with 500,000 Islamic extremists, they mean it. And there is nothing in this document that will stop those people from coming. Indeed, I fear we face a direct threat to our civilization if we allow large numbers of people from that war-torn region into Europe. It is ironic that 9 days before a British general election, Mr Cameron and Mr Miliband are not engaged in this debate, and in fact the UK can do nothing. We are impotent. We have surrendered our ability to get involved. I promise my party will stand up to this impending disaster for all concerned.
Herr Lamberts, Sie wollten eine Frage stellen.
Mr. Lamberts, you wanted to ask a question.
The first time that we've had these kinds of exchanges, I'd just like to remind you that many terrorist attacks that your United Kingdom suffered from were actually acts of your nationals. Not imported terrorists, but people who were homegrown. So I'm not sure that any of your answers is an answer to that issue. Thank you.
I do accept, Mr. Lamberts, that our failed policy of state-sponsored multiculturalism has led to a fifth column inside many of our countries. However, the number of those is mercifully small compared to the number of Islamic extremists committing the most bestial acts on a daily basis right across that region. This policy has no means and no way of filtering out extremists in favour of people fleeing in genuine fear of their lives, and as such we are making a massive mistake. Let us follow the example of Australia. Let us do everything we can to reverse the hypocrisy of groups like yours that have voted to make Africa poorer. Let us do those things. But if the message is that anybody that comes will be accepted, we are headed for disaster.
Herr Abgeordneter Faria, ich hatte den
Mr. Faria, what are you insulting me? What exactly are you gesturing?
Thank you very much. I had a question. I was just putting up my blue card and I wasn't given the floor. You gave the floor to my colleague, that's all. But what I wanted to ask Mr. Farage was whether Mr. Farage...
No, sit down. That's not the way it goes. I said at the beginning of the debate that there were thousands of requests for the floor, and I would only ever take a single blue card question, and you were by no means the first. None of that entitles you to insult the President of the House. The next speaker is Mr. Salvini, non-attached.
Thank you, President. I have heard a wave of hypocrisy and racism from the left. I am ashamed on their behalf. I've heard the same things that they said a year and a half ago after the deaths off Lampedusa. They didn't have the posters, let's help them, let's provide help. But since then, another 3,000 deaths in the Mediterranean. Just how many smugglers do we want to finance? How many deaths do we want to have in the Mediterranean? It's incredible that the President of the
Mr.
Salvini, there is a question from our colleague Forenza. Are you prepared to take it? Yes? Mrs. Forenza. Thank you. I'd like to say to Mr. Salvini that really, when it comes to racism, he's a master. And financing Mare Nostrum, do you agree it should be financed? Or that people who are fleeing war and poverty should die, either in the war or in the Mediterranean, which is what he would seem to be suggesting if we don't in fact save people in the Mediterranean. And I have to say that Mr. Salvini's words may not have been hypocritical, but they were disgusting nonetheless. Mr. Salvini to answer. You think that 1 billion African citizens can arrive in Europe and live in Europe? Do you really think that can happen? Do you actually believe what you're saying? Or do people pass you messages? I think Mare Nostrum was a racist operation financing Islamic terrorism and traffickers. I think the only way out is to finance these countries and so that the people don't try to escape from them. I was in Nigeria recently, which I think the left wing should do, visit these companies, because I think the European Union should be able to grow and people should be able to live where they are born. But that's not what we're seeing, and we're actually seeing ethnic cleansing, which is something we would oppose in any case. Thank you. Next speaker, Mrs. Hohlmeier for the EPP. Disaster after disaster. There's no point in this if we do not do anything. We need to act. We unfortunately have dragged our heels for 30 years now. 30 years ago the immigrants were ourselves. How were we welcomed at the time? Let's not forget that.
Thank you. We have a blue card, Mr. González Pons. Will you accept a blue card? Yes. Okay. Madam Albion Guzman.
Gracias. Señor González Pons, me gustaría...
Thank you very much. I have two questions. Do you think that rescue missions should be like in Ceuta with the security forces shooting on immigrants while they're at sea? Do you think asylum policy should be like Melilla, when we actually prevent people from asking for international protection?
Gracias, señoría.
Thank you very much. Well, Ceuta and Melilla are the only territorial borders that the EU has with Africa. Spain is under the obligation to defend those borders, and we must prevent any kind of injuries, damages for those who try to cross these fences, these walls. It can't be a no-man's land between the border of Spain and the border of Morocco. And I should perhaps point out to you that only 3% of the people who cross this fence unlawfully in Ceuta and Melilla, only 3% actually apply for asylum. You have mafias, and they are trafficking people, and they are actually helping people cross the terrestrial border, territorial border as well.
Now for 1.5 minutes, Madam Sippel.
Vielen Dank. Ja,
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed. We can't accept everybody who wants to come to Europe, but we could take in more if all member states were more committed to refugee policy and labour migration policy. With the latest tragedy off the coast of Libya, it's time for a sea change in EU migration policy, and Council has failed to deliver this signal. What is uncontroversial is that we have to deal with the problems in the source countries. We have to fight the trafficking gangs. But the higher our fences, the more dangerous the journey, the more of an incentive there is for the traffickers, the organized criminals. It is shameful that there are still member states who don't take in a single refugee as part of the reception program. That cannot go on. We need to share refugees across member states, and we need to use the measures we already have to allow refugees to live in our countries. We have to improve the labour migration system, because in many member states we need labour, and not just in universities but in other jobs too. It's time now for member states to act, and I call upon you, recognise the signs of the present time and act.
Thank you. We have many requests for a blue card. Will you accept one question, please? And I would say at this point we will have to limit blue cards because the debate will overrun, so I beg your forbearance on that issue. I now ask Mr. Glezos to put his question for 30 seconds, please.
I will agree with you totally. The basic reason has not been discussed yet here, because it's European countries who were colonists who have caused all these issues in their colonies from which these people come to us. But there is one country, Turkey, which is the one which sends most people to us, and is the country which wants to become a member of the European Union. So what measures would you propose for that particular country?
That was a speech with a question perhaps at the end. I'm not sure if you caught the question within the 30 seconds, but you have the floor.
Ich denke, ich kann es ganz kurz machen.
Don't worry, Madam President, I'll be brief. It would be wrong in the present situation to wag a finger at a single country. What is happening affects all countries in Europe and around Europe. That's why I'm not going to answer a question regarding one single country.
Thank you. Our next speaker for 1.5 minutes is Mr. Kirkhope.
Presidents, Commissioners, Europe must act decisively. Every effort should be made to save lives, create stability in conflict regions, and assist member states overwhelmed by the challenges they face. But many in this Parliament believe the solution lies in more forms of legal migration and binding quotas. My group did not sign the joint resolution because such actions merely address the symptoms rather than causes. Member States need to commit more resources and offer more humanitarian resettlement and aid. We need efficient asylum processing and an expedient return system. Frontex, Europol and EASO need to be better equipped. Lives can be saved by not allowing trafficked vessels to depart in the first place, and by cutting off the fortunes that are being made by human traffickers. This needs urgent cooperation with third countries to be achieved. True and meaningful solidarity is gained through trust, a moral imperative, and a sense of responsibility which can never be created through compulsion. I would say to Mr. Farage, who for the moment seems to have emigrated or sought asylum elsewhere in this country, of course it is wrong to confuse immigration and asylum, but to deliberately confuse immigration